Welcome to the Are We Idiots Show, where we question the status quo on society's important issues while mixing in plenty of laughs along the way. Now here are your hosts, Mark Weaver and Rich Kroll.
Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Are We Idiots Show. We are your hosts, as always, Richard Kroll and Mark Weaver.
Mark R. Weaver, great to see you again. I believe this is our 70th show, and
70th episode.
I'm trying to see what is looking older, the amount of shows or you as you get closer to 70.
Well, working with you all this time definitely puts wrinkles on my face.
That'll make you older quick.
Happy New Year to all of our listeners. Looking forward to a great 2020. And we're starting off with some great series of shows. You may have heard our last episode, but we're starting off with a great run of shows here early in 2020, so we're excited. And Richie, we always start with a tip of the day, and since we're on New Year's Day, what do you have for our listeners as we start this new year?
You know, this one might be more appropriate for folks getting longer in the tooth, not necessarily our younger participants and audience.
All those millennial listeners we have?
All those millennials that drive us nuts, although some are great. Some close to us here are great. But this is the time of year, right, where we eat and drink a ton of garbage. I don't know about you, but between extra alcohol, cookies, processed meats, people are just flooding you with alcohol and drinks and food 24/7. People tend to get acid reflux besides getting fat.
I think I put on 5 pounds yesterday alone.
You did look a little, the chin was hanging down a little lower than usual. But I don't know about you, but antacids and are on the mind, acid reflux, that heartburn.
I hate that.
It's one of the worst, right? So I want to give a tip out there to folks trying to combat the problems and symptoms of heartburn.
Okay.
You know, we all know Tums and antacids, right?
Right.
Relieve the symptoms.
Yep.
Do you know there's actually acid reducers out there in the same form as like a Tums?
And what are they?
So an acid reducer actually attacks the problem of those little pylons in your stomach that produce the acid.
Okay.
Right? So again, we don't treat the actual source, we always treat the symptom in the world. So an antacid will help get the burning out of your throat and lungs.
Right.
But an acid reducer will reduce the amount of acid that's being produced,
Gotcha.
curing the problem. Now, an acid reducer doesn't kick in as quickly,
Right.
but it will last a heck of a lot longer.
Now, is this a prescription thing? Or?
No, you can get them both. I mean, if
okay.
you have it really bad,
Right.
you can
I
get a
used to take a prescription one, but
Okay.
not anymore.
but you can get them over the counter right in the Tums section, antacid section.
Yeah. And the worst is when you lie down at night with acid reflux. That's the worst.
Well, they say if you do have it, make sure you lie down with your head elevated.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Kroll, for our listeners today.
Anytime.
And by the way, as we start this new year, thank you to our patrons, Mark Zlotnikoff, Eric Weaver, George Muldoon, Mike Smalls, Chris Barbie, Scott Carney, Alvaro Puga, and Larry Helms.
Helms.
Sorry. Holmes. I was thinking Holmes, our guy from high school basketball. But Larry
I don't
Helms.
see the connection whatsoever, but that's a good
Helms,
excuse.
Holmes. Sorry about that, Larry. But anyhow, thank you to them. And
Tom Rafferty? Was Tom Rafferty mentioned?
No, Tom Rafferty's still not in there, and he
What
probably
the
still
heck?
has not listened.
Probably not.
But we have an exciting show today, and in the studio to talk to us, Rich, I was actually thinking about this before Moises came in. This might be our first episode out of 70 where we have a legitimate expert in the studio.
A legitimate subject matter expert.
Yeah, so Moises Rendon is here in the studio with us. Well, welcome, Moises.
Thank you.
Welcome,
you for having me
Moises.
in the show.
And Moises is here to talk to us today about the Venezuela situation. And we've actually titled the episode as Venezuela and Socialism Warnings, because if your listeners aren't that familiar with the details of what's going on in Venezuela, a lot of the initiation of what is current came from some of the same verbiage we're hearing now from some of the far left Democratic candidates. So Moises will go into some detail on that. But we're first going to do our Idiot of the Week awards, and Moises has brought a nominee as well as Rich and I. Then we're going to talk in detail about what happened in Venezuela and the socialism warnings. And then we're going to conclude the show with Moises doing a little predicting, a little prognostication about what will happen in Venezuela. He'll give us the optimistic view and the pessimistic view over what will happen in Venezuela over the next few years. So it sounds like a good episode. Moises, you ready to go with us?
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, good. So Rich usually starts. Rich, Idiot of the Week. What is your nominee? And then we'll go to Moises, and then I'll go last.
So to coincide with my heartburn recommendations, a Wisconsin woman who called police on Saturday didn't necessarily have an emergency or really need any immediate help, but she was very angry about her chicken sandwich from Kentucky Fried Chicken. Authorities responded to a KFC restaurant in Waukesha around 8 p.m. on Saturday after an unidentified woman contacted them claiming the fast food eatery's drive-thru employee was giving her attitude. So the ordeal began when the woman ordered a chicken sandwich but received an incorrect order. I think there was missing pickles. The local Patch reported, citing police records. KFC staff offered to make her another sandwich, but she refused to eat it in disgust with the treatment she was receiving from the KFC employee. The woman called police while waiting in the drive-thru. Once they arrived, she told them she got a new sandwich but did not feel comfortable eating it. She thought they may have spit in it, and she wanted her money back. Officers said, "Ma'am, in KFC, this is not a police matter."
Yeah. And by the way, they absolutely spit at it. If you're causing that much trouble.
Do you guys ever send food back in a restaurant ever?
Rarely.
Yes,
Rarely.
not normal.
Like, even if you get a steak that's like totally raw or something, you can't send it back, right? Am I right?
You just don't try. Plus, I worked in a restaurant, so I know there's some stuff that goes on back there where you don't really want to know about. All right, so that's nominee number one. Moises, what is your nominee for Idiot of the Week?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I was just looking at the news, and people like to travel, and I saw this news coming to my attention. And one United Airlines passenger got shamed for getting a little too comfortable during a flight, seizing the moment to groom himself on the go. The bald man was filmed using an electric razor while shaving his head in his business class seat.
Oh!
His questionable behavior was later was filmed and then shared widely in social media. So
He was shaving in his seat?
yes, yeah.
What kind of moron?
So I'm a bald guy.
Yeah.
Right? And I shave my head once a week with a razor. And I can tell you now, little
Yeah, it's
shavings,
hair.
and scalp and everything else comes off with it. Can you imagine doing that and being the person next to that guy while he's doing it?
Plus, you're paid what, $2,000 a seat for business class to get that treatment. I can see it in the last row of coach, maybe. Anything goes back
Or in
there.
the bathroom, right?
Yeah,
Right.
maybe.
Unless there's a woman licking the toilet seat in the bathroom.
Oh, that was a different thing. All right, Moises, that was a good one. All right, so Richie, my nominee is right up your alley. Comedian Whitney Cummings told late-night host Conan O'Brien that she was reported to Human Resources last year for saying Merry Christmas to an intern.
Oh, boy.
Last year, I was working on a show, got into trouble with Human Resources for saying Merry Christmas to an intern. Conan O'Brien says, "Is that really true?" Asking in disbelief. "It's absolutely true. I was leaving. I was like, bye, guys, Merry Christmas," like just kind of off the cuff. She came back in June to start the filming for the next season, and HR called her in. They said, they said that, where is it? Sorry, I lost my place. No, they explained that the person had registered an official human resources complaint and that the intern wasn't really that bothered religiously because they were agnostic. So Whitney Cummings is like, well, wait, how could I offend them if they were agnostic? So anyhow, I just thought that was right up your alley. It's getting to the point now where you can't even say Merry Christmas or you'll have an HR violation filmed against
this
you.
could set me off on a whole new tangent. I mean, it's the victimhood culture. It's wanting to attract attention. What the heck is wrong, folks, with saying Merry Christmas? First of all, whether you believe Jesus was God or not, Jesus was born. And about 2.5 billion people actually worship him across the world. We have Christmas. Oh, did the guy complain about getting off for Christmas? Right?
We don't know if it was a guy or girl, but
Girl or
it was
guy,
an intern,
folks,
nonetheless.
If you would have said to me, Happy Arbor Day or Happy Kwanzaa, I could care less and I'll hug you. What is wrong? Who gives a hoot?
I don't know. I guess they're easily offended. Outrage is a currency nowadays, Richie.
Probably educated in an Ivy League school.
So you're the judge, Richie. Which of these three gets the first idiot of the year for 2020?
Well, this is a hard one because there's no egregiously obvious one. They're all idiots. Maybe out of the goodness of our hearts, we should send each of them $1. But
You got to make a call.
the HR thing's happening a lot. With you got to say Happy Holidays, so that's kind of common. We've been hearing a lot of the crazy behavior in these fast food chains.
Yeah.
If you have the cojones
Yeah.
to sit on an airplane, a public airplane,
Shave your head.
and shave your head with little hair follicles and scalp falling all over the place,
Oh.
you
Ugh.
are an idiot, and you are the opening idiot of the week for the year.
2020. All right, good job, Moises. You got the winner. You got the
Moises.
winner, and that means we send them $1.
So you have to send him $1, Moises.
Yeah, we'll take care of that.
All right, so we're going to transition now to the Venezuela discussion. And with us today, as we mentioned, is Moises Rendon. And Moises happens to also be my son-in-law. And I'm very proud of the work that he's been doing. So, Moises, why don't we start with at least telling the audience what you do now, your current position, and then we'll talk about your background in Venezuela. So, what's your current position, and what have you been doing over the last couple of years to try to affect the Venezuela situation?
Sure. Thank you, Mark. So I'm the director of the Future of Venezuela initiative at a think tank based in Washington, D.C. that is called the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Right.
It's one of the biggest think tanks or research institutions in the U.S. and one of the biggest in the world. And what I basically do is trying to inform policymakers and decision makers in the international community, obviously with a very strong focus in Washington, D.C.
Right.
and the U.S. government, on what to do on crises like the Venezuelan crisis, right? And this is a very complex crisis that we all need to find solutions, and part of my job is to inform those solutions, to recommend solutions, and in a way raise awareness as well of what's going on in Venezuela and how this crisis affects Latin America as a region and the U.S. directly too.
Right. And Moises is probably too modest to bring it up, but a lot of policymakers in Washington seek Moises out for his expertise in this area. You've been to the White House and briefing for the National Security Advisors. You've testified in Congress.
Correct.
And obviously, he has a series of white papers and podcasts and published articles all around this realm. Is that fair to say that you're kind of the go-to guy right now in Washington for the Venezuela situation?
Yes, I believe so too. We have built a very active place to discuss policy in Latin America, but specifically on Venezuela in Washington. So yeah, it's been great.
And the reality is that, and Americans tend to overinflate their importance in the world, but the reality is that American policy really can have a big effect. And we'll talk about later on in this in the segment kind of what you think that the future holds if America has any say in the matter. But why don't we give the listeners a little background, because my guess is that most listeners have heard that things are bad in Venezuela, but they don't understand any kind of detail, certainly not the detail that you understand. But why don't we start back? You grew up in Venezuela, in Maracay, right? Is that
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And that is a city in relation to Caracas. Where is Maracay?
It's a 2-hour away city. I mean, it's a 2-hour drive from Caracas.
Right. And when you were young, Venezuela was an extremely prosperous nation, right? Tell listeners a little bit about what it was when you were young.
Yeah, sure. Well, Venezuela was one of the most sophisticated, richest countries in the region. And at some point post-World War II, migrants from Europe used to go to our region, and they picked Venezuela as one of the top places because this was a country that offered opportunities, prosperity. It was an open market. The government had check and balances. We had strong institutions. So in a way, we used to absorb migrants from all over the world. And suddenly, everything collapsed. In a window of 20 years, the country has gone through the worst humanitarian, economic, political crisis that Latin America has ever seen in modern history, right?
And there's some history there in Latin America that has had some troubles.
Exactly. And this was all man-made. There was not an earthquake or a tsunami, right, that destroyed this country.
Right.
Everything was done by corrupt institutions, bad intentions, and it was all man-made. So it's in a way some precedent how we saw a collapse of a nation and done by only people like that, right? Yeah.
Right. So I also know that Venezuela had with the largest oil reserves in the world. Is that
correct?
Is that still the case, or is that I know that that's what a lot of the wealth came from, right?
In a way, yes. Yes, it has the largest proven oil reserve on Earth, more than Saudi Arabia. It has minerals, it has gold, uranium, it has natural resources like beaches, mountains. It's a great touristic destination for many citizens, or it used to be a very attractive destination. So in a way, it has everything that a country can offer to humanity.
So this mostly started with a guy by the name of Hugo Chavez. And how long ago was that? About 20 years?
That was in 1999 when he came into power.
So why don't you describe, why don't you describe the current situation? Like, how bad is it? I mean, I know I saw a statistic the other day. Last year was 4,000% inflation, right? Describe for the listeners how bad it is right now. Obviously you could go on for an hour, but give us the high bullet points of how bad it is right now, and then we'll go back and dissect how we got there.
Sure. So there are in severe food and medicine shortage all across the country. From the economic front, you have 1 million% of inflation, according to the IMF. The estimate for 2020 is that inflation is going to go up to 20 million. So maybe the number that you saw was more within a month or within a few weeks, but over a year, now we have a hyperinflationary economy, right? And that's only going in a spiral. It's only going to getting worse. So what does that mean? That people don't have enough income to afford basic items, like putting food on the table every day,
right,
and buying any commodities or any items. So therefore, we are now seeing one of the biggest refugee crises too, because people are now fleeing Venezuela, and there are over 5 million people have fled this country in the last 5 years and since 2014. And this is only getting worse, right? Because the economic situation is only getting worse. The political situation is kind of a stalemate, and people are not finding any way to survive but to flee the country.
Right, which is perfectly understandable. So, Richie, how are we doing so far for the common man out there?
So far, so great. I'm learning a lot just sitting here. I do want to make sure we cover something that sounds almost impossible.
Okay.
I believe you said 1,000,000% inflation?
Yes.
Can you put that in perspective with buying something that a normal item or normal, because that just seems impossible.
Sure. Yes. No, definitely. So, you have a salary of about $15. It's one of the lowest salaries in the region, by the way. So you have about $10 to $15 monthly stipend as a minimum wage in Venezuela.
A month.
And with that, the prices of a liter or a pound of milk it changes every day, basically. So when you go to the groceries on Monday, and you have a 50 cents milk to buy, and the next day it will be $1, and then within a week you see that price
be $4.
Yeah, you see that price going up very quickly. So the inflation spiral is amazing because prices go up in a matter of hours or even days or even hours.
So is it like the old adage of like it takes a wheelbarrow full of money to buy something? Is that what people are doing, or are they just doing without, or what?
Correct. The currency, the Venezuelan currency called bolivar, is worthless, and now people are not using the cash anymore. In fact, they're using the bills, the paper money, to build and to make little sculptures or cursors because it's completely worthless. And also it's a cashless economy now because the paper money, it costs more money to print the paper money
That's worth.
than what it's worth.
So they're not printing anymore, probably, right? Because the government probably can't even afford to print the money.
Correct. So there's a shortage of cash in Venezuela as well.
Right.
So in a way, we're seeing a dollarization, unofficial dollarization of the economy, because people are turning into the dollar as the main a change of value currency, right?
And that's all black market, right?
Yes, exactly.
But the waterfall effect, now I got light bulbs going off in my head. So people can't afford to buy things. Then how can businesses stay in business to provide the stuff? They're not taking any income in either. It just sounds like a vicious circle.
Well, that's actually a
Cycle.
good transition because what I'd like to talk about is how did we get here? And one of the things that the government did is they took over businesses. But why don't you start back from Chavez time? What actually did? How did Chavez come to power? What was he promising the people?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Before Chavez came to power, he was a military, right? And he was born in a rural city outside of Caracas. It's called Barinas. It's on the plains of Venezuela. And he was raised in a very ideological family where they saw socialism and Cuba as a model. As he was growing up, he was reading a lot of ideological heavy books about how to make Venezuela a socialist country.
Like Karl Marx and stuff like that?
Yes, like Karl Marx. Fidel Castro from Cuba was kind of his biggest mentor in many ways.
That's a great person to choose.
So we had a very important financial crisis in 1989, 8 days after I was born. That was kind of a turning point for the country because the government at that time didn't really do much to stop that financial crisis and to alleviate the suffering of many Venezuelans, especially the poor people. And Chavez saw that as an opportunity to rise up as a leader, as a voice of those people who were on the shadows, basically. And since 1989, he was building this campaign, this very heavy rhetoric, populist campaign of offering the Venezuelan people a different thing. Yeah.
Like taking money from the rich people and giving it to the poor, free college, free medical,
Socialism.
Yes.
Offering socialism to bring the poverty up and baseline the extremely wealthy.
Right.
Which, in theory, at a very high scratch the surface level, sounds like a good idea.
If it's ever worked, yeah, that'd be great.
I'm egging you guys on to get to the.
But no, it's a very powerful ploy on people's emotions and envy. Envy is a very insidious emotion and trait. And so how did he actually come to power then? He sold enough people?
Yes, he sold it very well, and he called it the socialist revolution of the 21st century. And during the 1998 presidential campaign, he didn't really have alternative or competitors to put something different on the table because
Sounds like our government.
Two bad competitors.
and 78% of the Venezuelan people elected Chavez democratically, and even members of my family voted for him. This is a very important warning for anybody, the U.S. and any other democratic country, that if you take democracy for granted, then you can get into trouble because we see populist regimes getting elected democratically and changing the rules of the game while they are in power.
Right.
And we see that trend not only in Venezuela but in other countries in the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, Putin claims to be a democratic elected person, and a guy in Hungary now, same thing. Obviously, the Philippines. There's a lot of places that claim to be democratically elected, but we all know that they're dictators.
Right.
Well, there's a fine line, right, between dictator, socialism, communism, and usually the people leading the charge are kind of deranged or evil or egotistical to the point of serial psychotics. That can't be a good person to have leading the country
But
and
it's
ideals.
not.
Right?
It's not always though. Sometimes it's just they get inch by inch, and finally they get to a point. Like I'm sure when Chavez first came in, he was probably just saying mildly offensive things, or I'm just gonna tax the wealthy more and give all you poor people more, so you can make ends meet. And then before you know it, he's got the power and the military behind him, and he's literally taking over private businesses. Isn't that what that happened next, right? Pretty much.
Totally. Yes.
So what did he take over? Like the oil reserves? He took over all private businesses, or what?
Yes, he nationalized the oil industry in Venezuela, which is obviously the most important industry in the country. About 92% of this country's income come from oil. Although the oil production today is completely collapsed. Right. But yes, he first nationalized the industry. Then he went to the private enterprise, the private businesses. In a window of 10 years, he expropriated about 2,300 enterprises or companies.
How about the banks too? The banks too?
Yes, the banks, although the banks resisted a little bit longer. And I think there was a reason behind that because banks are so powerful and they control so many pieces of the economy that it's not easy just to go after a bank. But right. I think Chavez had it clear that banks will only be on their way, on his way. So he at the end of the day, he has to go after them. But yeah, he also sees lands. Venezuela, as many other countries, is rich in lands and lands that you can grow food and you can build it's a very notorious and rich land, and he went after those lands and with the argument that the elite were the only one benefiting from these lands, which wasn't really true. In the 20th century, you see a lot of middle class people working hard their lands to make wealth for themselves.
Right. Yeah.
And Chavez in a way sold it in the wrong way. He said no, the government should be taking over, and when he did it, the outcome was always the same. Those lands were always, or companies or the oil industry itself, collapse because
right.
when you get government corrupt institutions involved, then you get into trouble, right?
Right. And when in private enterprise, you have a profit motive to control costs. When it's not your money, you don't have that same motivation. And I guess what happened is then Chavez started to employ more people, and he had the military. And so any kind of rebellion, when it got to a certain inflection point, the rebellion was squashed, right? Is that what started to happen? People started to push back, and then they were squashed after this started to snowball?
Yes, totally. As you said, Venezuela had at some point 1 million public employees. It went up to 3.5 million public employees working for the government in a 10-year window. So Chavez increased the public sector by
3x.
Yeah, 3x. But yes, there were pushbacks by democratic forces in the country. There has always been pushbacks, but unfortunately, now looking back, we haven't seen those opposition forces aligned together, united. There has always been divisions among them, and I think they have committed key mistakes over time that allowed Chavez to intensify his grip into power. And I think part of that is his powerful rhetoric of populism, combining populism with socialism, and trying to sell this idea that he cares about the poor people and that he offers, opportunity for the poor. But as now we know, that the recipe and the outcome was devastating for this country.
So I have some questions that just pop into my head. So what's the total population of Venezuela?
30 million.
And he took the public sector from 1 million to 3.5 million.
Correct.
So he added 2.5 million people, probably at the much higher than the $10 to $15 per month. So they're kind of thinking, yeah, what you propose is happening. I'm participating in that. Right? Those 3.5 million people probably have his back.
Correct.
Right.
But there's still another 26.5 million people in the country, but you can't fight a tank with a butter knife.
36.5 million.
30. Okay, so there's another 33 million people,
Right.
but you can't fight a big strong military without
Right.
resources and means.
Right.
So, I assume the majority of the people of 5 million have fled, are anti this government, anti this regime, and how do you begin, which you're trying to do with maybe the help of the U.S. government? We can't just go in and topple the guy, right, and try to take him out with a coup. So, how do you begin the process of removing this guy, and is it even possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's not a silver bullet when it comes to solving the Venezuelan crisis, right? This has been going on for 20 years. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the Venezuelan people cannot do it by themselves, because most of the people that I talk to, they always tell me, we don't want to have any sort of intervention or meddling into Venezuelan business. But the matter is that the Venezuelan people cannot do it by themselves. They are in a way trapped or by very highly corrupt criminal networks that control all the institutions of the country. And that means the judiciary, the election branch, the police, the military.
And they're actually gone to like narco enterprise, right?
Correct. There's a lot of narco trafficking going on in Venezuela. As you know, Colombia is right next door. Colombia is one of the highest producers of cocaine in the world, and about 25% of that cocaine that is produced in Colombia is going through Venezuela. And after Venezuela, it gets shipped to Africa, Europe, Central America, and the U.S. And that's a lot of cocaine that we're talking about. And that cocaine networks become intrinsic into the government institutions in the country. So in a way, just to put it very simple and in short, the Maduro regime has become more like a criminal organization that controls different sectors of the country and are involved in narco trafficking, illegal mining, massive money laundering, corruption, and they have proven over time that they don't care about having the Venezuelan people starve to death. They're just enjoying, they're corrupt cronies enjoying their time
In power.
In power.
Yeah. And just for the listeners, so Moises mentioned Maduro. So what happened was, if you're not familiar, Chavez died of cancer, and then he's handpicked. He was a bus driver at one point, right?
Correct.
And so Maduro is the new president, and he's the same thing, all-powerful dictator, and not as charismatic as Chavez, but he has the power. And I would almost say that the narco trafficking was done out of necessity because everyone knows it's highly profitable, and the people needed something to make money, right? Because there was just not enough enterprise in Venezuela to. So the government's like, hey, if this is the only way to make money, we might as well get in on it, right?
Yeah, and that's a good point back to Rich's question. It's hard right now to. So right now, the U.S. policy and other like-minded countries' policy is to increase pressure on the Maduro regime. And the main way they try to do that is through sanctions, economic, financial, diplomatic sanctions. And sanctions is a huge topic, and we can dive deeper if you want, but the different type of sanctions, right? The individual sanctions and sectorial sanctions. Venezuela has it all. It has an individual and sectorial. They have tackled now financial sector, the oil sector. So
the U.S. is putting sanctions on individuals and businesses now.
Correct.
And for the last year or so?
Yes, for the last 3 years.
Okay.
And it's not only the U.S., Canada, Panama, few countries of the European Union has now imposed individual sanctions as well. And now Latin American countries are finally getting together to think about how to sanction the Maduro regime as well. So it's a U.S.-led movement, but it's not only U.S., it's a multilateral approach that we're seeing in Venezuela, right? But going back to Rich's question, that hasn't worked out. We have been sanctioning Venezuela for over 2-3 years, and it hasn't worked out. And one of the reasons why it hasn't worked out is because of what you were saying, Mark, that the narco trafficking, the criminal component of this crisis, is now serving as the main lifeline of the Maduro government. And
It's replaced oil, right?
to replace oil. So
Liquid gold.
so the way he's paying his military, his government officials, is coming from the narco trafficking.
Well, that's interesting because there's a history of sanctions led by the U.S.
Oh, yeah, all over the world. It
all
doesn't
over the
work
world.
that well.
Whether it was Russia or Cuba,
Iran right now,
Iran, a lot of the countries in the Middle East,
North Korea. Doesn't seem to be
Korea.
working there either.
Normally, we've gone after communist countries or countries that are oppressing their citizens, but sometimes it works, or sometimes it does create behavior, but sometimes it makes things worse.
Right.
Right? If it's not properly analyzed, and what are the ramifications? So apparently, it's not working in Venezuela.
It also helps the oppressed nation to gin up the support of the people by saying, "Hey, the reason things are so bad is because the U.S. is putting sanctions on us. It's not because of us. It's the U.S. sanctioning us, and that's why things are bad. So don't blame us, corrupt government. Blame the U.S." Right? That goes on
you
too.
can turn that around.
Yeah.
So Moises, you just said something which might be a good segue to wherever Mark's going with this. But so this problem now is expanding outside of Venezuela, right?
Yes.
The drug trafficking, which wasn't maybe a big part of the country 20 years ago, 30 years ago, now you're impacting Africa, you're impacting the U.S., you're impacting all these other areas. So what started in Venezuela is becoming a world problem, not just a problem for Venezuela, right?
Totally, Rich. This is a crisis that is now a regional crisis, and the main way it's affecting is through two ways. One, a humanitarian refugee crisis that now we're seeing and we're witnessing. Right? As I mentioned, there are 5 million people have fled this country. About 2 million are in Colombia. About 300,000 are in Peru. 800,000, are in Peru. 500,000 are in Ecuador, and about 500,000 have fled to Europe. So in a way, Venezuelans are now spreading all over the world, and many of them are in basic needs. Right? They are just looking for ways to survive. First we start seeing middle class people fleeing the country,
Right.
and now we're seeing the most vulnerable poor people fleeing the country. And this is creating a lot of consequences from the health, from the humanitarian, and
Is there bitterness in Colombia, for example, of all these Venezuelans coming over and
Yes.
burdening their society?
Yes, I have always said that Venezuela has always been lucky to have Colombia as a neighbor, because Colombia has always had an open arm policy towards Venezuelan refugees. But that's now getting into its limit, right?
Right.
And now we see some social backlash because Venezuelans are taking over, jobs in Colombia. They are also, you see a little bit of a crime or some sort of, handy pocket type of a crime going on in the streets of Bogota.
Right.
And Venezuelans are in a way desperate. They just want to work. They don't want to. First, they don't want to leave their home. They were forced to leave, and they all need a work permit to start working and providing for their families. So
Sounds eerily similar to for 1,000 years, people used to come from Mexico migrate up into the Southwest to work, and then they go back, and then it's really only been the last 20 years where there's been some bitterness in our country about them coming over, and it's some of the same issues that you're talking about. They just want to work, most of them. There's obviously some criminal elements sometimes,
right.
but they're the rare exception.
Mark, do you? I kind of see where you might be going with this. Do you think Trump will be advocating for a wall on the southern border of Mexico? And can you get them?
He advocated for on the southern border of Colorado a while back. Did you hear that? He said the
didn't
walls
hear.
on Colorado.
Yeah, why not? Just put a wall around everything.
So, Moises, we have to move the discussion a little bit. So, what I'd like to hear from you is when you hear, and we'll just highlight Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. And I'm not asking for your political leanings, but you have experienced some of these same talking points where, the word fairness and this disparaging capitalism. And what is your thoughts that most Americans that don't really think that this could ever happen here? What is it should we be watching out for? This kind of talk from political leaders about fairness and about how capitalism has failed. And how does it relate to the U.S.?
Yes, thank you. I do have concerns because, Venezuela was my home country. And I witnessed how this country was destroyed due to socialism. So when I hear, candidates in the U.S. talking about how socialism offers benefits to the wider society as a whole, I have big questions and big concerns. One, for example, when I hear that we need health care for everybody, that sounds wonderful, right? Like we do want everybody
free health care, right?
Free, exactly.
And free education.
And free education. And that's what Chavez used to say to the Venezuelan people back in 1998. And that's why people like him too, because, who doesn't want free access to all these great benefits?
While we're at it, let's wipe out all accumulated student loan debt too, Rich, because it's not right for people to have debt.
How about wipe out having to pay for food? Why not throw that in there?
Houses? Everyone deserves a house. How about a car?
Smartphones? Why pay for anything if you have taxes? Enough taxes.
We're being facetious, but no, I cut you off a little bit, but no, it's scary because it is a very powerful message. And if people are just thinking about what can I get for me today without any of the broader consequences, you can definitely see how it could get to a point where someone would be able to sway people. And they get 51% of the electorate. Look out.
Yes, totally. And it can be dangerous too because it's easy to sell it.
Right.
And when it comes, one of the key debates is the creation of wealth. And Venezuela, as we were talking, was one of the wealthiest nations in South America. And right when Chavez came in with his policies to have the government intervening on the private enterprise, imposing price controls, which were one of the drivers of inflation, by the way, and imposing controls on currency exchange. When Chavez came in, you couldn't even exchange freely your money with other world currencies. We also saw the expropriation of lands. We saw the government taking over colleges. One of the things that he offered is public free colleges for everybody in Venezuela. Today, those colleges that Chavez expropriated are either closed or now being used for political purposes to train government officials to align with the government party.
Unbelievable.
You know what I don't get? Why don't enough smart people or influential people ask the question, hey, that's great. I'd love all that too, but how do we get there? Like AOC, right? She was big in free this, free that. And then
she still is.
Right, but when you actually do the math, it's like $837 trillion it's going to take to be able to even
because
all
all of those people usually say, well, our brand of socialism just hasn't been done right yet. I mean, that's usually their explanation that, well, yeah, you can't look at Venezuela or you can't look at Cuba or you can't look at that. They made mistakes. We would do it right. That's usually the explanation. But, even like a Nobel laureate, this guy Joe Stiglitz, was praising Chavez in the first several years of what a wonderful experiment that this is turning out to be and how he was doing socialism right. This guy won the Nobel Prize in economics, Joe Stiglitz. And, of course, he's been totally, lambasted in the last 10, 15 years. But there's a lot of smart people that say that, capitalism is evil and capitalism is wrong. And by the way, I'm the first to admit crony capitalism
Right.
is awful, and it happens in our country. And there's lots of things in our country that I hate. Lobbyists, we're going to do a show on lobbyists here in a few episodes, and lobbyists are a scourge to our society. So capitalism is not perfect, but we know socialism doesn't work. And what happens is, instead of the power going to the wealthy, which is what the anti-capitalists say now, what happens is the power goes to the government and the few that are involved in government, and that's where power is consolidated, and they are the new aristocracy, yet everyone else is penalized. 95% of the country goes down in wealth. So
it sounds like Moises and the rest of the country didn't get this brand of socialism correct.
Well, Moises was smart. He got out. So, okay, Moises. So we have a few minutes left. I'd like to hear your predictions of the optimistic view for Venezuela, which I know that you're fighting for, and what you want to happen. And you can go into some detail of how you see that coming about, and it's probably involved with some of the stuff you're working on with pressure and sanctions and ultimately the people rising up. And then unfortunately, we'll also want to get the pessimistic view, and then we'll close the show after that. So what do you think? Optimistic view, pessimistic view for the intermediate term for Venezuela?
Yes, great. Unfortunately, I don't see this going to the right direction for many reasons. I'm not going to get into the details, but looking at a positive, optimistic track, I could see the government led by Juan Guaido, who is a congressman, the president of the National Assembly of Venezuela, who is now recognized by 54 countries as the constitutional legitimate president of Venezuela, right? And that happened early in 2019 because of rigged elections, presidential elections in 2008 that Maduro, in a way, stole. So that was a great success. It's unprecedented how the world and the U.S. and other countries responded to this, and by recognizing a different leader other than the one controlling the territory and the institutions of the country, right? And that kind of put us in the right track.
And is that still the case? I mean, all these countries still recognize him as the leader? That's kind of amazing. I'm sure most people listening don't understand that the Maduro, who's the president of the country, is not recognized as the leader by 54 countries.
Correct. And that's still the
crazy.
case. And that's not an individual decision or a multilateral decision by external actors like the U.S. or even Trump. That was because the Venezuelan constitution specifically stated that when you don't have a democratically elected leader, then the president of the National Assembly becomes an interim president until free and fair elections can be held. And that's why Juan Guaido kind of supported by the constitution, ask the international community for formal recognition. And that's where we are today. So having that international recognition of this interim government combined with, as you said, social pressure, social protests in Venezuela, combined with the Venezuelan military stepping on Guaido's side and recognizing that Maduro is no longer legitimate, and he also is starving its own people, combined with external pressure, with sanctions that are smart sanctions that are targeting the right people and the right sectors, I think we could see some sort of building up momentum where Maduro says enough. This is I can't go any longer.
Right.
That's kind of the optimistic view.
And don't you think of that? Isn't the military the key to that? I mean, really. Yes. I mean, at the end of the day, you can have the best speeches and people can riot, but whoever controls the tanks and the heavy weapons, I mean, to me, that has to happen.
So the pen is not mightier than the sword?
No, unfortunately not. Not when you're getting killed.
Darn.
Yes, you're correct. The military is a key component, and the reason why they haven't fallen into against Maduro is partly because the Cubans are big time in Venezuela, and part of what they do is monitoring and in a way breaking down any military organization that will go against the government of Maduro's government.
Right.
So that's
That's the obstacle.
That's the obstacle.
Yeah.
And we haven't seen the Cubans stepping out of Venezuela yet.
Okay, so the worst case scenario or the pessimistic scenario is what? The status quo just continues?
It's a slow unraveling of the current situation in Venezuela. We're now we're seeing 5 people fleeing the country.
5 million?
According to the United Nations, that number is going to go up to 6.5 million by the end of 2020. According to the OEAS, the Organization of American States, that number is going to go up to 8 million by the end of 2020. And that
So
means-
20% of the country.
Yeah, a quarter of the population.
Yeah, almost,
Right.
yeah.
So that's the worst case scenario, obviously, and we're now gonna see. Unfortunately, is also the most likely scenario today.
And Mark, you're still not good at math, right? Because
20%,
would
that's
be
right.
6 million.
No, it's 40 million people, and I thought you said it was 8 million. He said 8
You're the one
million.
who told me it was 33 million people.
No, it's 40 million, he said, right?
No, I said 6.5 million according to the United Nations, 8 million according to the
Of
OAS.
what total?
Of the total of 40.
Of 30 million.
Oh, okay. So, all right. So I thought he said 40. So.
I'm always there to correct you and help you.
Thank you. I need it. Okay, well, Moises, that was great. I mean, even though obviously you're my son-in-law and I've heard a lot of this, I actually learned some things today, and hopefully our listeners did. But any final comments, Rich or Moises, before we close the show?
You know, I'll tell you, the U.S. is a pretty darn good country to live in. I know there's a lot of poverty in every city, but overall, from freedom standpoint and pretty much come and go as we please and have whatever we want, I don't think most U.S. citizens are cognizant of the rest of the world. Maybe those that travel, but for the most part, we're in our little happy, comfortable glass bubble up here in the U.S., and we don't really know what some humans, just like you and I, same height, weight, age, intelligence level, are going through.
Yeah.
You know, we don't really pay attention if it's not affecting us, whether it's South America, Africa, wherever. And if you think about it,
This is Moises' home.
this is his home.
yeah.
And if you look at, I also think most U.S. citizens don't realize that there's a lot of affluent, wealthy, modern countries. Venezuela was probably right in line with a lot of them back just 30 years ago.
Right.
So it is scary that this can happen to a flourishing, good bunch of folk country
Right?
in a matter of 20 or 30 years just be kind of destroyed.
Yeah.
And that can...
It's actually, is it the poorest country now by GDP in the Western Hemisphere?
Yes, by far.
So final comments for you, Moises?
I mean, no, aligned to what Rich was saying, I think Venezuela can serve as a wake-up call to anyone, especially the U.S., which I agree. The U.S. is one of the greatest nations that we witness. I'm super happy to be in the U.S. and supporting of this country in so many ways. But again, when you take democracy and check and balances and all these principles that we believe on, rule of law, for granted, then you can get into trouble because in a matter of few years, everything can change. And again, and I witnessed it myself with my own eyes in Venezuela. So that's kind of a warning call that I always tell my American fellows.
Thanks for educating us.
Thank you for being here. And my final comment is that I've said on this show multiple times, and as a small government advocate, there's really only 2 serious threats to our way of life here in the U.S. One is nuclear war, which I want to try to do the best we can to eliminate all wars, but particularly nuclear war. But the other is the growth of government, and the growth of government has many different facets, including debt. But the growth of government has an exclusive monopoly on the legal use of force, and we have to be very, very guarded. We have to always check government and scrutinize government. And I hope that the voices out there continue to do so. So thank you again, Moises.
Thank you for having me.
And make sure you listen to our next episode where we have another expert in the studio, Rich.
Wow.
We have a cryptocurrency expert. My daughter, Alexa Weaver, will be joining us for our next episode. And we're going to talk about a little primer. I know you like that
Primer?
word, a primer on cryptocurrencies. We'll talk about Bitcoin. and we'll try to do it in layman's terms the best we can. But it should be a great episode. Looking forward to it. And as always, please remember, if what you see or hear sounds idiotic, then we're just the guys to help you sort it out. See y'all next episode. Take care.
Thank you for listening. Please download, subscribe, share, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, and also our website.